Western Australia is older than almost anything else on Earth. The rocks beneath your feet in the Pilbara have been dated to 4.4 billion years. That is not a rounding error. That is older than the moon formed properly. Older than the ocean settled. Older than nearly every geological process that shaped every other landmass on this planet. And scattered across that ancient ground, from the red desert interior to the windswept coastal headlands, there are structures that nobody has adequately explained. Not cave paintings, not ceremonial stones that archaeologists file under probably ritual use and move on from. Actual structures, arrangements of rock and earth that required planning, coordination, and a purpose that modern researchers are still arguing about. Some of them stretch for kilometers. Some of them align with astronomical events with a precision that would challenge a modern surveyor. Some of them were built using techniques that the accepted timeline of human habitation in this region simply does not account for. Western Australia's Aboriginal peoples have the longest continuous cultural history on Earth. 65,000 years of occupation, minimum, based on current archaeological evidence, possibly longer. The structures on this list exist within that context, and some of them exist well outside it in ways that make comfortable categorization very difficult. 12 structures, 12 genuine mysteries, none of them in the textbook, all of them in the ground. If you find yourself watching content that actually goes looking for the things mainstream archaeology prefers not to linger on, subscribe now and hit the bell. There is more of this coming. Now let us get into it. Number 1. The Murujuga petroglyphs of the Burrup Peninsula. The Burrup Peninsula, now more formally known by its Ngarluma name Murujuga, juts into the Indian Ocean from the Pilbara coast near Dampier. It holds the largest concentration of ancient rock engravings on the planet. Not one of the largest. The largest. Estimates of the total number of individual petroglyphs range from 800,000 to over 1 million distinct images carved into the dark red surface of the ancient rocks. The scale alone defies ordinary comprehension, but it is not the scale that makes Murujuga genuinely difficult to explain. It is what is carved there. Among the tens of thousands of images are depictions of animals that have been extinct on mainland Australia for thousands of years. Thylacines shown in groupings suggesting direct observation rather than cultural transmission of an older image. Megafauna species whose last confirmed mainland appearances predate most conventional estimates of when these engravings were made. And faces, human and near-human faces rendered in a style that has no clear parallel in the broader corpus of Australian rock art. Some of the petroglyphs have been dated using techniques that measure the depth of surface weathering. Estimates from multiple independent research teams have placed portions of the Murujuga engravings at between 30,000 and 40,000 years old. A small number of assessments have suggested figures considerably higher than that. The confronting element is this. The images that appear oldest by weathering analysis are not the simplest or most abstract. In some documented sections, the technically more complex images correlate with the more severe surface weathering, which inverts the assumption that artistic sophistication arrives late in any cultural sequence. Murujuga is also under active industrial pressure. The Woodside LNG processing facility sits on adjacent land, and ongoing petrochemical development has damaged portions of the engraving field over several decades. The structural mystery of these images exists alongside an ongoing conservation crisis that the Western Australian government has been criticised internationally for managing inadequately. Number 2. The Wandjina cave formations of the Kimberley. Move northeast from the Pilbara into the Kimberley region and the nature of the mystery changes. In sheltered rock overhangs and shallow caves across a geographic area larger than many European countries, there are painted figures that defy straightforward cultural classification. The Wandjina figures are large, often life-sized or larger. They are painted in white, red, and yellow ochre on sandstone surfaces. They have wide oval heads surrounded by radiating lines that their creators describe as representing clouds and rain. They have large, dark eyes. They have no mouths, and they have been repainted continuously by successive generations of Karijini, Wunambal, and Warora peoples for a span of time that oral tradition measures in terms exceeding any simple archaeological date. The repainting tradition is frequently misunderstood. When researchers note that the figures appear fresh and well preserved, the explanation offered is often that they were simply painted recently. What that explanation skips over is that the repainting is itself the tradition. The Wandjina are repainted to maintain their power and their relationship with the living community. The underlying images beneath the accumulated layers have not been examined in detail by any research program with access sufficient to draw confident conclusions. What makes the Wandjina formations structurally interesting beyond their visual strangeness is the geographic distribution. The figures appear across an enormous and varied region with remarkable consistency in the core compositional elements. The oval head, the radiating surround, the eyeless face, the absence of a mouth. That consistency across hundreds of separate sites and tens of thousands of years points to a source of remarkable stability in the original image. Number 3. The Gwion Gwion figures of the North Kimberley. Distinct from the Wandjina in style, the Gwion Gwion figures appear across the sandstone country of the North Kimberley in a form that has generated sustained and sometimes heated academic disagreement about their origin, their age, and their relationship to the traditions of the people whose country they occupy. The figures are painted in fine detail. They depict human forms in dynamic postures, wearing what appear to be elaborate headdresses, tasseled garments, and ornamental accessories. The pigment used is not the standard ochre of most Australian rock art traditions. It is a dark mulberry colour derived from a specific type of wasp nest mixed with organic material, and it has penetrated the rock surface rather than sitting on top of it, making conventional surface layer dating techniques unreliable. The academic controversy around the Gwion Gwion figures is substantial. One research team in the 1990s proposed dates of up to 17,000 years before present based on wasp nest material overlying some figures. Other researchers challenged the methodology. The debate about dating remains unresolved to a degree that makes any confident claim about when these figures were made scientifically premature. What is not in serious dispute is the technical quality. The level of detail in the finest Gwion Gwion figures, the rendering of movement, the suggestion of layered clothing and adornment, and the compositional sophistication of multi-figure groupings represents a standard of observational draftsmanship that sits outside what most introductory accounts of Paleolithic art would predict for this region at the proposed dates. Number 4. The stone circles of the Pilbara interior. Away from the coast, in the deep red interior of the Pilbara region, pastoral station workers, survey teams, and occasional bush travellers have documented stone circle arrangements that have received almost no formal research attention. The circles vary in diameter from a few meters to arrangements spanning several tens of meters. They are constructed from locally sourced rock, predominantly ironstone and quartzite, placed with an intentionality that distinguishes them from any natural geological process. The stone selection within individual circles sometimes shows a preference for particular rock types or colors that are not the most locally abundant, implying selective gathering rather than opportunistic placement. What makes these arrangements difficult to file away quickly is the absence of any documented tradition in the ethnographic record that straightforwardly accounts for them. 65,000 years of continuous occupation across an enormous landscape includes periods of cultural disruption and the loss of specific knowledge that dispossession and colonization accelerated catastrophically. The stone circles sit in that gap between the physical evidence and the explainable record. Some researchers have proposed that the circles represent the foundations of structural shelters. Others have suggested astronomical alignment functions. A small number of independent investigators have documented apparent alignments between specific circles and solstice or equinox sunrise positions. That work has not been subjected to peer review and must be treated with corresponding caution. But the alignments documented are difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence across multiple independent sites. Number 5. The Woodstock ossuary, Pilbara. In the 1960s, a pastoral worker on a Pilbara station discovered a natural rock overhang containing human skeletal material deposited in a manner inconsistent with straightforward burial. The remains were grouped. They were associated with worked stone tools of multiple distinct technological traditions, and the accumulation suggested repeated use of the site over an extended period rather than a single interment event. Subsequent examination produced radiocarbon dates placing some of the material at over 10,000 years before present. Later analysis pushed components of the assemblage older still. The site is now understood to represent one of the longest continuously used burial locations yet identified in Australia. What makes Woodstock structurally interesting beyond its age is the evidence it provides for intentional mortuary practice at a time depth that challenges simplified narratives about symbolic behaviour in early Australian populations. The grouping of remains, the inclusion of specific tool types, and the apparent selection of a particular sheltered location over thousands of years of continued use suggests a ceremonial relationship with the dead that is sophisticated rather than incidental. The site is not on any tourist itinerary. It sits on private pastoral land, and access requires negotiation with both the station and the relevant traditional custodians, which is appropriate given what it represents. Number 6. The horizontal waterfalls passage structures. The horizontal waterfalls in the Buccaneer Archipelago off the Kimberley coast are one of the most dramatic natural features in Australia. Tidal surges force massive volumes of seawater through two narrow gaps in a coastal ridge, creating what appears to be a waterfall running sideways across the surface of the sea. Less discussed than the natural phenomenon are the structural anomalies documented on the ridgeline above the tidal channels. Stone arrangements on the ridge tops do not correspond to any obvious functional purpose related to fishing, shelter, or navigation. Their positioning above the passage points suggests observation rather than habitation. The tidal behaviour of this area would have been dramatically different during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were substantially lower. What is now a narrow coastal ridgeline would have been a prominent inland topographic feature overlooking a vast coastal plain that now lies under the Timor Sea. The stone arrangements on what is currently a remote and difficult to access ridge may have been created in a geographic context that no longer exists, in relation to a landscape that has been underwater for 10,000 years. That temporal framing makes interpretation essentially speculative, but dismissing the arrangements as incidental on the basis of their current setting misses the point entirely. Their current setting is not the setting in which they were built. Number 7. The Marandoo earthworks, Pilbara. In the mid-Pilbara, in country opened for iron ore mining during the 1990s, survey archaeologists conducting heritage clearance assessments documented a series of earthwork features that could not be straightforwardly categorized under the standard heritage classification system then in use. The features involved deliberate modification of the natural drainage landscape. Low walls of placed rock directed water flow across the terrain in patterns inconsistent with either natural deposition or the small-scale resource management described in the ethnographic literature for this region. The scale of the water management suggested either a larger population than the historical record accounts for, a longer time depth of landscape modification than the standard model allowed, or both. The heritage clearance process, in the context of a major resource extraction project, is not the ideal environment for resolving complex archaeological questions. Some features were recorded, some were not recorded in the detail that would have allowed subsequent analysis. The mine proceeded. The ground is no longer available for examination. What the Marandoo earthworks represent is therefore partially an argument about what was lost rather than what is known. The researchers who documented what they could before clearance are clear that what they found exceeded their initial expectations and was not fully resolved within the time and resources available. Number 8. The Shark Bay Shell Middens. Shark Bay on the mid-western coast is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized primarily for its living stromatolites, the ancient microbial mat formations representing one of the earliest forms of life on Earth. Less prominent in the tourism literature are the extraordinary shell middens lining significant portions of the coastline. Shell middens are common in coastal archaeological sites globally. They represent accumulated waste from shellfish harvesting over generations. What makes the Shark Bay middens structurally unusual is their scale, their internal organization, and in several documented locations, the presence of non-food material incorporated into the accumulation in patterns suggesting the middens served a function beyond simple waste disposal. Some Shark Bay middens have been dated to ages exceeding 8,000 years, with basal deposits at certain locations going deeper still. At those ages, the coastline geometry was substantially different. The middens were not built where the shore currently sits. They were built on a now submerged coastal margin and have been exposed progressively by the particular erosion dynamics of Shark Bay's sheltered waters. The non-food material inclusions in certain documented middens include work stone from non-local sources, ochre, and in one context, elements that the examining researchers described as consistent with deliberate deposition rather than incidental inclusion. That interpretation has not been substantially followed up in the peer-reviewed literature. Number 9. The Dampier archipelago underwater structures. In the shallow waters around the Dampier archipelago, recreational divers and commercial fishers have over several decades reported the presence of what appear to be stone wall structures on the seafloor. The reports have been inconsistent and difficult to verify systematically, partly because visibility in these tidal and sediment-disturbed waters is frequently poor, and partly because formal underwater archaeological survey in this region has been limited. What has been formally documented is that the continental shelf in this region was substantially above sea level during the last glacial maximum. At peak glacial conditions, approximately 20,000 years ago, the coastline sat roughly 120 kilometers further west than it does today. The Dampier archipelago islands were not islands. They were hills above a coastal plain extending to the continental shelf edge. Any structures built by people living on that coastal plain would now be between 20 and 120 meters underwater, depending on precisely when they were built. The shallow sections of the archipelago, where diver reports have been concentrated, correspond to the portions of that drowned plain closest to the original coastline. Formal underwater survey of this zone has not been conducted. The reports from divers remain anecdotal. The geological case for the existence of extensive dry land in this zone during human occupation is not anecdotal at all. The combination of those two facts represents a genuine research gap rather than a resolved question. Number 10. The Bungle Bungle ceremonial sites. The Bungle Bungle Range in the eastern Kimberley is one of the most recognizable geological formations in Australia. The distinctive orange and black banded beehive-shaped towers of Devonian sandstone rising from the Ord Valley are familiar from nature documentaries and tourism campaigns. What receives considerably less attention is the ceremonial and structural archaeology within the range itself. The Purnululu Massif contains rock shelters, water catchment features, and stone arrangements examined as part of management planning for the national park. Several present interpretive challenges that the park's management documentation acknowledges without fully resolving. Among the documented features are stone arrangements at elevated positions within the range, showing consistent orientations that do not correspond to the practical requirements of shelter, water access, or pathway construction. The orientations of several structures align with the entry points of the major gorges, which function as both physical corridors and, in the oral tradition of the Gija people whose country this is, as pathways with ceremonial significance extending well beyond their practical utility. The relationship between the physical structures and the ceremonial geography they appear to mark has not been examined in depth in the published archaeological literature. The Purnululu sites present a case where the oral tradition of the custodial community provides a richer explanatory framework than the academic record currently does. Number 11. The Karijini Groove Formations. Karijini National Park, in the heart of the Pilbara, occupies a landscape of extraordinary geological drama. Ancient gorges cut through banded iron formation rock in narrow, deep slots, revealing geological strata representing billions of years of Earth history. Most tourist visitation concentrates in the gorges themselves. On the plateau surfaces above the gorges, across the flat ironstone pavements stretching between the incised drainage channels. There are groove and cupule features that have been documented in the archaeological literature, but remain poorly understood in terms of their purpose. Cupules are hemispherical depressions ground into rock surfaces. They appear across every inhabited continent. The function of cupules is genuinely debated in the archaeological literature. Proposed interpretations include game pieces, sound-producing instruments when struck, ritual markings, and territorial boundary indicators. At several locations in Karijini, cupule fields are associated with groove features, incised lines running across the rock surface, in arrangements that have directional properties not explained by any of the standard functional proposals. Some groove arrangements lead from a cupule field toward a gorge edge, ending at the point where the ground drops away below. The relationship between the above-ground groove network and the gorge system beneath has not been the subject of any formal research investigation. Number 12. The Zuytdorp Cliffs Anomalies. The Zuytdorp Cliffs run for 170 kilometers along the mid-western Australian coastline, a sheer limestone escarpment rising directly from the Indian Ocean with almost no beach at the base and no river access for hundreds of kilometers in either direction. The cliffs are named for a Dutch East India Company ship that wrecked on them in 1712, one of the most isolated maritime disasters in recorded Australian history. The Zuytdorp wreck is well documented and is not the anomaly under discussion. What is less documented is the evidence of structural features at various points along the cliff top that do not correspond to any known European activity in the region, and that predate the wreck by a margin consistent with Aboriginal occupation. The clifftop features include stone arrangements at two documented locations that appear to mark vantage points over the ocean below. One arrangement has been described in unpublished survey notes as forming a semicircular enclosure open toward the sea. The function of a structure at this location, at the edge of a sheer cliff above an ocean, with no landing beach and no fishing access, is not obvious. The Malgana and Nanda peoples, whose country includes the Zuytdorp clifftop, have oral traditions associated with this stretch of coast, and the significance of the ocean horizon in those traditions is attested in the ethnographic literature. The specific connection between the physical structures and those traditions has not been investigated in any published form. The Zuytdorp cliffs remain difficult to access. The clifftop survey coverage is incomplete, and the structural anomalies noted in the existing limited survey work have attracted no formal follow-up. They sit at the end of this list not because they are the least significant, but because they represent the most complete research absence on it. Almost nothing is known. What is known is enough to justify the journey. 12 sites. 12 genuine gaps between what exists in the ground and what the current frameworks of explanation can confidently account for. What runs through all of them is the same confronting reality. Western Australia's deep human past is not well understood. The oldest continuous cultural tradition on Earth left traces across a landscape that has been geologically dramatic, climatically variable, and for most of that time, utterly removed from the attention of any civilization that kept written records. The petroglyphs at Murujuga were being carved when the rest of the world's oldest cities were still tens of thousands of years from existing. The Wandjina figures have been maintained through an unbroken tradition that started before any monument in the Middle East or Europe was built. The structures on this list do not require a sensational explanation. They do not need to be attributed to lost civilizations or ancient contact. They require something considerably simpler and considerably harder to deliver. Sustained, properly resourced, genuinely respectful research that treats the oldest human culture on Earth as the world historical phenomenon it actually is, rather than a footnote to a story centered somewhere else. Some of these sites are under active threat from industrial development, from inadequate heritage protection, from climate change altering the conditions that have preserved them. Some exist in cultural contexts where custodial communities are still determining what kind of external research engagement, if any, is appropriate and welcome. None of that makes the mysteries less real. It makes the urgency of engaging with them properly considerably greater. If this opened something up for you, drop a comment telling us which of these sites you want a full dedicated video on. The Murujuga petroglyphs alone could carry a 2-hour documentary without reaching the bottom of what is documented and unresolved. Subscribe so you are here when those go up. We will see you in the next one.